both, Mark, so if you can mark it.
Okay, so Shelly Sacks, slate 1, take 1, space.
Lovely. Yep.
One of my earliest memories is the kitchen, and the kitchen as a kind of arena, because in the kitchen everything got played out. So my 2 white parents were there, my blood parents, and who were lovely, but the 2 other parents were there who were not recognized as parents and who also kind of brought me up, and everybody would meet in the kitchen. And there was often tension in the kitchen, and all the kind of hidden things that one couldn't understand. What I really couldn't understand, I remember asking my mother when I was about 4 or 5, why Kay and Grace, who were the kind of gardener and my nanny, couldn't come and eat at the table. And my mother was kind of completely shocked and horrified and didn't know what to say. And I think what that kind of repeated, that conversation, or why did they eat on tin plates and we ate on china plates, and why were they going to the back of the house to sleep, and why didn't they have rooms in the house? And my mother was a musician. She was a really lovely person. She wasn't a racist, but she used to just shrug and say, that's how things are. And so it was this. There were a few other incidents. Once when I was 8, I remember sitting in, we were quite poor, but we were white, so we had black servants. And I remember sitting in a little car one sort of early winter's evening, 5 o'clock in the rain in Johannesburg, and just seeing these long queues of people, old women with no shoes and heavy bags, and asking my mother, like, why are these people, why have they got no shoes, why are they standing in the rain? And again, she just shrugged and said, that's how things are. And this how things are became like a kind of mantra. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I used to go to bed at night and just cry and think, like, how can this be? Why is Grace outside in a little room and she never sees her child? And it was a million questions. And so I think that image I've got of the kitchen, I see it again and again and again and I think that was a kind of founding image of these terribly unspoken, unconscious conflicts. I remember one of the other things that was very clear was my mother on Thursdays having to quickly write out this letter that was called a special, that my nanny had to have in order to go out once a week to see her child who lived in Meadowlands. And without a special, if you were black, you were picked up on the streets by the police and put in a van and could just disappear. So the special was from your madam, who said, I give permission for Grace to be out from 9 o'clock till 6 o'clock. So there was curfew. This was probably late 50s. So this letter once a week, again, was this picture of, but like, why does Grace need a letter? Why don't we need a letter? So there were just a million images: driving to school with a van in front of you, a lorry in front of you with 2 white people sitting in the front, and 50 people jammed in the back like sardines being taken to mines or factories or whatever, kind of grown men. So there was, I suppose those were the one lot of images. I think it just came from pain. It was completely, when I was very little, it came from confusion and pain, because I could see everybody's beautiful eyes and beautiful faces and the stuck situation and me asking questions, and there seemed to be no answers except the kind of shrug. When I was very young, I was already painting from when I was very young. And when I was 6, when I was 5, I won a big competition. And I suppose there was a person, I had to give a talk to St. John's Ambulance to about 200 people when I was 5 with my painting. And the painting was of an angel where there was dark underneath and white in heaven, but in heaven there were a few black spots, I remember. And I had to explain it, and I remember explaining that on the ground was where all the people told lies, the rich people told lies. And in the sky there were just a few little bits of this bad stuff. But the woman who helped me write my speech had a strange name, and I only recently found out about her, Scarnell Lean. And she was a Rosicrucian. When I used to go to her house, my father used to take me to her house to write my talk. She often used to be on her head, so I think she was into yoga and theosophy or something, Rosicrucian. But I didn't know then, and she was really amazing. She took me very seriously and helped me write the speech, which was about, in a way, how art transforms people's lives. So that was when I was 5. My parents were really amazing. My father had come from a family of doctors and ran away from medical school, didn't want to be a doctor, wanted to be an artist. And my mother came from a family of millionaires and had been a performer, an actress and a singer, and was one of the first women pilot in South Africa. But her brothers would never let her do any of it because nice Jewish girls didn't do things like that. So they were both, I think, really wanting me to do whatever I needed to do. And we were quite poor at one point. I remember my mother used to sell mulberries on the side of the road when I was 4 years old that we used to pack so that I could go to art classes. So I think they were both. But what's interesting for me, especially later, many years later, when I went to work in Germany, and I had never really thought of myself as Jewish, but in Germany people did, and would start telling me their whole sad story and how they didn't really know what was happening and things. And I, in a way, could always understand it because my parents were those people. As I grew up, and I would say to my mother, my friends are dying, my friends are being tortured, my friends are disappearing. When I was 14, 15, and she'd say, no, that can't be true. You're making things up. This is a, democratic country. Things couldn't be like. So I think their unconsciousness and their kind of being locked into the collective kind of story about Zwart Gevaar and what will happen and communists. So, from 12 years old, I was just seen to be a communist because I was asking too many questions and had the wrong friends and had black friends. And so they were amazing people who were so sensitive and thoughtful and artistic, but weren't scholarly people, weren't learned people, and were somehow locked into this collective story. When I was 14, my father died. He drowned. And a friend of mine who was a musician, actually it was the same time I met Alex Mavro, a guy called Mike Dickman, who was a musician. And his father kind of saw what kind of art I was doing and found it amazing and said, there's an incredible teacher, you should go and work with him. And that was Bill Ainsley. Bill Ainsley had this whole, it was later called the Johannesburg Art Foundation, but before that, Bill was a kind of center of cultural exchange and would have these big garden parties on a Saturday. I was the youngest person there. And the garden parties were because nobody could talk inside. And at the garden parties were the kind of Nadine Gordimer kind of people, the whole Communist Party, writers, plus black artists, musicians, the Malumbos were there. So I grew up those next 2 years before I went to Cape Town with Dumili and the Malumbos, and David Kolwani came later, but there was a whole network of musicians, artists, and lots of people fleeing. Bill would help. Bill was part of the 50s march on Pretoria, the kind of pass burnings. And so there I was, this very kind of young teenager, the youngest of all the people. But Bill was an incredible teacher. So he fed me books and questions and was very challenging. He gave me Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet when I was 14 and said, read this. And because of the whole milieu, I began to understand that there was another whole grouping of people who didn't accept the status quo and who were voicing it and who were finding a way to get it out in the world. So Dumili taught me sculpture for 18 months before he fled. But there were always disappearing people. Omar Badsha, I remember one night in a car somewhere with Omar Badsha fleeing the security police, hiding. Everyone was always hiding in backs of something, fleeing in Johannesburg anyhow, security police. Cape Town was calmer, much calmer than Johannesburg in the mid-60s, early 60s. The provocation was on a lot of different levels. The provocation was that there were, I don't think anyone was worried about my art at that stage, but the provocation was that people weren't towing the line. That was the first provocation. The provocation was, especially the writers, were speaking out. People were getting views and literature and stuff out. And I suppose that's what was echoed when I got to Cape Town and I came into contact with Brian Asbury and Yvonne and Athol and that kind of grouping. But the provocation, I suppose, was just people who were refusing to be silent. And it was both in the art. I remember when I first saw Dumili's paintings of kind of shouting, crying Africa, it was kind of manifest in every way. It was manifest mainly in the writing and the images in the art. And the musicians, though, I suppose the provocation was that black people and white people weren't being separate. We weren't obeying the divisions. We weren't keeping in our place. The word that just came to mind was freedom, and I think I'm still working with that concept, but I think art takes myriad different forms of exploring our freedom, exploring new terrain, exploring not accepting the givens, not accepting the status quo. So I know for me at that early time, Bob Dylan, somebody gave me The Times They Are A-Changing soon after my father died, and that was the only way I could make sense of anything in the world, and through that got to know about the civil rights movement. But I suppose all art is still, in whatever ways, potentially, a lot of it's about building careers and going into galleries and becoming a celebrity. That's one stream, but I think people who are genuine in whatever art form they're working, even if it's quite non-representational, it's not directly about political struggles, is always somewhere about opening up, going into new territory, exploring the unknown, exploring oneself. It's somewhere about freedom. And this, I think, was the major provocation in South Africa, with all the kind of interface between all the political issues that were there, and wherever there were thinkers, artists are thinkers, but who embody. They don't just put their stuff in books that are complex and philosophical. They actually ask questions, and it can destabilize things. So I think for me it was really about freedom. And even from my littlest beginnings, I can remember this little Shelly. It was a space to dream. It was a space to, gradually as I got older, to look at other possibilities, to imagine other ways. It's about agency. I remember seeing Sizwe Banzi is dead, and being absolutely stunned. But I think before that, I was quite close friends with Alex Mavro and Tessa Marwick, and I think they were possibly, and Billy Tanner, they were perhaps already involved before I saw Sizwe Banzi. But I remember being stunned by Sizwe Banzi. And I remember Richard Wake coming to me one day. He was my teacher then. And it was probably, I don't know if it was as early as 69 or 70, but him saying, there's at the Space Theatre, there's a possibility that we could have an art space. So I think the art space came after the theatre space. And we had a little meeting with Kevin and Richard and Dimitri and Gerrit Hilhorst and myself. I don't know who else was there, maybe Shelly Sacks, can't remember, but about the possibility of this art space. So what was really interesting for us was Richard had come back from Europe with an amazing catalogue by a guy called Harold Zeeman, had done this exhibition When Attitudes Become Form in '68, and it was a kind of key driving force in the sculpture department. The sculpture department at Michaelis was like the hub of experimentalism, and Tessa was across the way, across the driveway. We were in the Egyptian building and she was in, I can't remember what the building was called, but where they did movement. But movement actually meant anything. It meant leading to guerrilla theatre in the streets. And so there were these kind of two hubs of activity. And then outside the big gates and the big walls, South Africa always had big gates and big walls, was Government Avenue. And I know I did a lot of kind of impromptu, spontaneous performance. Johnny Nankin and I everyone used to lie and smoke dope at lunchtime in the avenue, but the police were kind of marching up and down. And we used to do quite provocative events that were somehow between. Sculpture wasn't really sculpture. Sculpture was installation and performance, and Tessa's whole grouping, it was kind of performance into guerrilla theatre. Well, it was amazing, but they were little enclaves. So Richard Wake was radical. Kevin was also, I suppose, involved in that, quite radical, but it was really Tessa. There was a whole hub around Tessa. The universities weren't that radical. The universities were closing down on a lot of things. The students, I remember Jeff Budlander, who's now, I think he's an advocate now, but there was kind of 68 new SAS. We were all on the steps always. We were outside. And I got put out of the painting department for asking too many questions. So there was quite a lot of conservatism. I think one shouldn't see, a lot happened at UCT, but partly through the black students who were mobilizing and who were linked with NUSAS. It certainly, there were all over, there were amazing people, key people who were allowing it to happen, who were participating in it, and who were, nourishing the students with new thinking, new ideas. But it certainly wasn't the university. It was the people who were prepared to step out of line. So the kind of stuff Richard Wake was prepared to do with us, although he wasn't political. My political art education had been with Bill Ainsley in Johannesburg, but Richard was doing radical experimental things in terms of materials and processes, and so was Tessa. Tessa was doing really radical stuff, and with Bill Tanner, who wasn't her student but who was kind of involved. It was almost a community of people in and out the university. Well, I think the opportunity, actually it was one of the key amazing things, turning points, because up till then, a lot of us were doing work that we could see had parallels in Europe. So there were people like Vito Aconci and people doing radical performance work, but we couldn't see where and how we could do that. Myself and another woman called Nina Ram in '68 had done a whole lot of actions in the streets, because in the streets more than two people together was an illegal gathering. So we did stuff with just the two of us, and one of us would pretend to be a dog and the other the person, and we could say whatever we liked about the situation, tell the dog what was going on. So we developed endless strategies. I'm still doing work now in the university here, my whole master's program. The first half's called Creative Strategies, and it came partly out of those times of developing strategies for engaging in the streets. So the space was really an amazing possibility, because before that we were doing hit and run. So Nina and I, for example, were going into department stores and putting on makeup and doing Shakespeare, and then the Shakespeare would turn into contemporary commentary until somebody would come and ask us to leave, and if we'd refuse, then somebody would call the security or the police. And so until the space was there was nowhere else. The space was like it was an oasis that wasn't closed, which was amazing. It wasn't just internal for the converted. Anybody could come, and people did come. More and more, one started seeing people one didn't know and strangers. So this first invitation was just so exciting. And also what was exciting was that it was a kind of disused building. I think it was a disused building. And there had been no other culture in South Africa up to then was always smart culture for middle-class white people. And I had grown up in Johannesburg, so Sophiatown, that kind of was shebeens and amazing jazz, but there was white smart and black local homemade back of a shack culture. And the space was the first possibility where in this kind of old building, factory, warehouse, where we could shape it ourselves. And so the renovation, when you say, you know, you were all volunteers, and how come, where did the energy came from? The energy came from the fact that we could shape something ourselves. It wasn't just an institution. We didn't have to beg and plead to do something that was a bit too radical in the institution. And I think that's why there was so much energy to shape it ourselves and to have a space where there could be conversation, there could be dialogue. So I know quite a lot of things I did, I can't imagine. I had decided already when I was 16 I was never ever going to work in an art gallery because of what the gallerist said, that I needed to paint blue paintings instead of red ones because they didn't match people's furniture, and he couldn't sell them as well as he could sell the blue ones, and I was horrified. And so the space was for me, it was the only way I could imagine having an arena to work in the world. It was really an arena outside the university, and the university it was not closed officially, but it was somehow all the people who were into the same thing were there. I didn't even know there were loopholes. It was for me just an amazing space where one could go. And I suppose because I'd come from Bill Ainsley's whole group in Johannesburg, I had had that kind of contact a lot already for years. So I wasn't so aware. Plus for me, Cape Town compared to Johannesburg was the ultimate liberated space because the apartheid laws had not been upheld in the same way. Plus there was this whole middle grouping of people, so-called Leerling, so-called coloured people, who were actually, people didn't seem to uphold, you know, the buses were not segregated in the same way as Johannesburg, and people didn't seem to uphold the bench segregation. So it was a bit looser and a bit freer. For me it was like free land compared to absolute stark divisions of black and white in Johannesburg, where you couldn't talk to a black person on the street without somebody coming to see what was going on. But the space was incredible like that. Yeah, there was a meeting area and an eating area and just conversations, and suddenly one stepped outside this very divided world into a place of conversation, a place of exchange, sometimes a place of conflict, which was real. I remember being challenged a lot about different things that I was doing there by both white people and black people, and that there was some kind of new normal that the space enabled. But also rage, and very thoughtful rage. I remember Ethel's plays especially, and Yvonne, that made such a huge impact on me, that how things that could be said kind of nowhere else were being said there. And that the people were brave. I remember thinking how brave Brian was for actually somehow, one knew Brian was somehow the one who held the whole thing together, and just for going on, you know, continuing to make this space. And it was a great name. It really was a space for many things. I don't even remember where the idea came from for Allegory of the Mind. I was working a lot with meat, I'd done a white wax column. I did a few that were placed in different parts of the city that had lamb chops buried in it, and on top was a statue of David, a white marble statue. And I remember people freaking out. I suppose that's where it started. So this wasn't the thing at the space yet, where I had just little strings hanging out of this pristine white wax column that looked like marble. But as the meat rotted inside, because there was a bit of air, I suppose, the stench would come out, and everybody wanted me to move these things. And I kept saying, why should I move them? Isn't smell part of art? And then people would say, well, maybe, but not such a bad smell. And then I go, oh, so bad smell's not part of art. I can remember that part really clearly. And that mapped really onto the work I was doing at the space, because in the space, it was about the third or fourth thing. Dimitri and I had done one thing a couple of years earlier where I had stapled a pig, a belly of a pig, to a lectern in a lecture theatre in UCT at a conference. And Dimitri had read out Beckett, and I just stapled this pork belly to the lectern. So I'd done quite a lot of things with meat, really, and often in silence, trying to provoke a response, discussion, something. But the thing at the space, there were 4 lambs, actually, 4 dead lambs hanging in sealed bags, and I knew that probably at some point they'd burst. And there appeared this whole question again about smell and bad smell, and you have to get it out of here. I was phoned one night, late at night, and told, so this was even the space, by my professor, actually. They'd contacted him to say, tell her to get the lambs out of the rotting meat out the space. And I refused and said, even here, I can't have rotting meat. And it was, no, it's offensive and the people are coming to the theatre. And so eventually I agreed to remove them and went and buried them and replaced the meat hooks with text that said dispatched, and stood there and spoke to people and said I'd had to dispatch the bad smell to the townships where all other bad smell was dispatched. So I think, yeah, that I was really keen to get people to just this question of what was bad and what was unacceptable and where were the boundaries, and how did we know black people needed to be in the townships. And so that was the parallel. But the eggs, I'd done a lot of paintings of fried eggs, and I suppose their eyes and their life. It was probably, I'm not sure if I was a vegetarian yet. Yeah, probably had been, yeah, I was probably 3 or 4 years already into being a vegetarian. And so they were really just about creating, it was like a concentration camp, just creating these silenced eyes, these silenced life looking up at one. I remember frying 400 fried eggs in the space. I did it as well on a little portable stove, and then putting up this barbed wire and just creating the conditions. I mean, now I look back and I think it was very illustrative in a way, but it wasn't just illustrative, it was also embodied with, it had all this barbed wire around it and signs up that said you may ask no questions, and there was a table for the clerk, but the clerk was never there. So there were all these kind of desk killer kind of murderers who no one had any responsibility. And all the work, in fact, I did at the space was about referees that couldn't answer questions and people who were taking no responsibility. And so I hovered around and sort of said to people, sorry, the clerk's not here, and kind of interacted with the audience. I wasn't aware at all. I think I was so into what was going on, I wasn't aware there was even that much press coverage. And I remember seeing one thing in a newspaper. I remember actually thinking, so this is, you know, I was young and my prejudices, but thinking a lot of the people who were coming to the theatre looked like the same rich Johannesburg people who I had tangled with in Johannesburg. And I'd got so angry when I was 11 and told my mother I was never ever going back to the synagogue again, because the community had deported a rabbi who'd raised questions about the people in South Africa, that they were replicating what had happened in Germany. And I had, and yeah, I'd kind of grown up with this anger and aversion to these kind of rich people, many of whom were Jews. And one has to say that it was, half the liberation struggle. So half the Jews were really the left and the Communist Party, but there were a lot of Jews who also turned a complete blind eye to the situation. And for me, that was one of the biggest agonies. And when I decided, actually, I don't want anything to do with this. So I remember actually the night at the space, one of the nights when there had been this, even before the the rotting lambs, and this group of people at interval coming up to me and saying, this is not okay. And I was so shocked that here was a kind of replication of the same very, we like culture, we like to sit in our seats and see radical theatre, but this is a bit too much. I lived tormented by that question. On the one hand, there was a question, many questions, but a kind of bundle of questions around the strategies and methods and ways one used in art, and if one shocked people or attacked people too much with the art, it would close people down. And that's been a thread that's gone through my life that really helped me find lots of different ways of working. So there was that on the one hand, but for me that was a huge problem, because still art, on the one hand, one part of me was with my comrades saying, this is just a bourgeois indulgence. What are you guys doing? This isn't going to make the revolution. It's not going to make houses. It's not going to give people food. And it's not going to change the system. So you're all kind of indulging. So there was always this kind of other narrative going on. It's all very well to kind of get off your anger, or you'll say what you have to say, but what is this doing? So it was amazing to have black artists like Dumili, who in a way was saying it's important to make our vision, it's important to make a new vision. And Graham, my partner, was actually one of the people who more than anything would say, and he said it to me and he said it to lots of people, why do you think we're making a revolution? So that there can be art. The artist must make art. The artist should not stop. Don't destroy yourself with the questions all the time about what's this achieving. So there were many artists, I think, who didn't do anything at all. There were others who depicted the situation or their anger. But I suppose there were others like me who worked both. Bill Ainsley had worked politically and as an artist. One always had decisions to make. Was one going to in a way allow one's art to be shaped by one's politics? Should one work parallel and separate or connected ways? And yeah, it nearly tore me apart. It was really a huge torment. I was also involved spiritually with a philosophy teacher from India, and all the people around him had a completely different idea. The art people, even my beloved teachers like Richard, was always, oh, come on, Shelly, stop asking so many questions, make your art. So I spent a lot of my time paralyzed, kind of not knowing how to make art that was actually transformative, that wasn't just making statements or shouting. When I think back now to people like Athol and Yvonne, I think one of the incredible things in their theatre was, although it was explicitly about the situation on one level, it was so finely crafted. And I think that level of not just finely crafted in terms of the form, but in terms of the thinking. So I think finely careful thinking creates and making and imagination creates space for insights. And now I can see that in retrospect. When I was 18, I actually used to torment myself because I couldn't see how my work would change anything. And so I lived, 1 minute making things, 1 minute making performances on the streets. People like Tessa and Alex Billy were important to me because they were also radical, but I also questioned all the time what we were doing in this rarefied world. So it was people like Graham, my partner, and other artists like Dumili who had kind of said, I just remember the sentence of Graham's, why do you think we're making the revolution? Because we love life, because we love culture. So the artists shouldn't stop their work. So, but it was a terrible torment, a conflict. I was asked that question. I was asked precisely to go for training and to learn to use a gun because it was time. And in the end, I couldn't go. I really couldn't go, and went and told my comrades, I can't do this. I cannot pick up a gun. And they were really nice and said, well, okay, we understand. But it was, again, the hugest dilemma, because here were people who I knew weren't violent people, so the people I was working with in the organizations, who were saying, actually, this can't go on. We have no alternative. The violence that's in our lives, it's killing people. People are dying. People are being tortured. We can't go on. This is the only way out. And I could hear what they were saying, but I'd become already at 18 a vegetarian because I couldn't kill a chicken. And I just couldn't, there was no way I could imagine, for me, learning how to use a gun meant having to accept that I would kill another human being. And I still don't know what the answer is. I often think, and I thought then, if the people in Britain had said that about Hitler, what would have happened if they were me? So I feel like, was I a coward? Did I believe so much in culture? No, I didn't. Other people had to keep re-encouraging me that through culture something could transform. Now I do. Now I think the space of transformation is imagination. I don't think violence is going to get anyone anywhere. We can see it multiple instances all over the world. So I work with people now in a completely different way, really trying to help them experience their agency, even the bad people, the wrong people. But it was a huge question. And, when I was asked, okay, now it's time to go for training, I couldn't go. So that I kind of lived with this question about, was it cowardice, or was it because I really knew I couldn't kill a person? But I didn't condemn my comrades who felt they had to use guns. I just knew I didn't know how to answer that question, because I kept coming back to the Hitler question. What would have happened if the people in Britain hadn't stood against Hitler, which meant they had to pick up guns? So I still don't know the answer. Now I think nothing can achieve anything on its own. And so there's a whole raft of interconnected things that need to happen. I think anything that opens a space for new perception, new awareness, shifts in oneself, but less fear, seeing new possibilities, anything and everything is good. We have to work on a multitude of levels, and that's one of the nice things that's come with getting old, is that I can see there are a multitude of levels to work on, from schools to old-aged homes to decision makers. And so the other thing I think is that is most important is to develop capacities for things like real listening, for opening oneself to views and values that are not really one's own. And what happened, it partly started happening in the 60s, maybe even a bit earlier in the 50s, and with the experimentalism in theatre and in America, was this kind of forum theatre kind of process, which again at the space was quite central, with Billy and people using methods of people like Cantor. But Augusto Boal where there's a kind of space for dialogue, a space for interaction, a space for opening up what we think. You know, I wish my mother and father, who weren't racists, but had contact with people like that, who could have helped them through dialogue, through conversation, look at new possibilities. So I think it's a very long, I don't think there are any ways. I certainly still wouldn't pick up a gun. Might be because I'm a bit of a coward, but also not because I could not, how could I kill and take another life? I would first put down my life, but in the hope that I could reason with someone, or not reason so much. I don't think reason, so that's also what I learned, that there are different kinds of thinking. And this is now the heart of my work. Imagination is also a kind of thinking. Imaginative thought is one kind of thinking. The thinking that's dangerous is pure logic, because with logic we can make a case for anything. So I don't want to get people into the space of reason. I want to get them into the space of experiential knowing and perceiving. And theatre can do that, art can do that, painting can do that, writing can do that, talking can do that. So wherever we can create arenas where we can also touch another person, who can feel even whatever they think, they have to come to themselves. They have to be present. If they're not present, you can't do anything with them. I haven't tried to work with neo-Nazis yet. I wanted to, and everybody stopped me. But my hope is, and I'm not that hopeful, because the problem is, I think once people are, was ist durchdrängt? I can't think of the English word. Once people are soaked in ideology, they actually you can't find them. So whether it's theatre or through a one-to-one conversation, you can't reach them. And that's for me the terror, when somebody's story is so strong, their ideological story is so strong that you can't reach them. But otherwise, I think theatre, writing, dialogue processes, all forms of engagement can touch the person, and then one can begin. Well, we're losing out on human being. We're losing out on not just the freedom. Human being is the only creature of all Earth's creatures that doesn't just unfold. A tree knows how to be a tree, and a giraffe becomes a giraffe. A person has got a potential to be compassionate, to care at a distance, to feel, to have empathy. But we're not born with that. We're born with a potential. And if we don't learn to respect, to love, to wonder, so one of the biggest losses with a world that thinks education is to fill people up with information, means that this potential to wonder, especially with so much media around, children don't even go dream and lie under a tree and think, what is a tree? So with the loss of wonder comes the loss of questioning, the loss of imagination. And human beings are the one creature, and we like beings in a process of becoming. If we haven't got the opportunities for human growth, for creative growth, for imaginative growth, what are we going to become? And that's why idiot people can start thinking, actually we can replace the humans with robots. Because if you think of a human being as a mechanism that just stores information, does all the functions a computer does, then obviously what's the difference? But if you think of a human being as someone, a creature that can ask questions, that can wonder, that can go into the unknown and find new things, that can appreciate, that can respect, without drama, without art, without music, without writing, without questioning, without philosophy, those things will wither away. I think in South Africa, when I look at how the curriculum is designed, the art curriculum, which is like draw a pot, this is how you draw a pot, whatever, it's tragic. But I think it's really happened in England as well. I don't think it's happened in all the European countries, in mainland Europe. I hope England's still part of Europe. I don't think it's happened in all the mainland countries, but I think it's the confusion about what is learning, what is knowledge. I mean, there's that lovely thing the guy who was one of Gandhi's followers said, Vinoba Bove, who said, educare, education, means to draw out of a person. We're not empty buckets to fill us up with information. And if you don't see a human being as a, I think the education system, I've had 2 children who've been through the state education system in England, and I was pretty horrified at, and that was some years ago. I think it's only got worse because I think the confusion now about we've got to get UK kids up to speed, and for sure we have. I teach them here and know how numb people are when they're coming in. But the way to do, I'm not against maths, I loved maths at school, but we have to even learn maths in an imaginative way. And so it's not so much what we learn as how we learn. And the arts are ways that one connects with things. When you said just now empathy, the arts are the way that we can, it's about experiential knowing and not just putting stuff in our brain. Otherwise we can just get a disc and put it in and kind of get something to read the information. Well, I think hub is a good word. We didn't use words like hub in those days. One always knew that you'd either be challenged, you'd be confronted with something. So in that sense, it was a kind of place of vitality in a world of restriction. So the point I made to you earlier about more than 2 people on a pavement was an illegal gathering. You can imagine how much most people who weren't quite radical self-censored, internalized, just immigrated, that lovely phrase of Hannah Arendt's where people just immigrate internally. So on the whole, and that's why theatre did something, it brought people out, not just to the space. But so the space was like, one could breathe and know that there were going to be these kind of, it was dynamic. So this contrast between this outside, very stifling space of self-censorship and heavy security, even if nothing was going to happen to you. Nothing happened to most people, especially if you were white. White people were pretty safe. But I think the degree of self-censorship in people like my mother were to be sure you didn't get into trouble. And so the space was the place where trouble could happen. And it was kind of, Brian was looking after us all, and he'd kind of make sure we were safe-ish. Well, yeah, there was the crossover. So the crossover meant that we knew we were engaged in one endeavor. So partly what was crossing over, there were lots of conversations between performers, directors, artists. And the conversations led to longer conversations and through the night conversations and possibilities, ideas for shared work. So people who you normally, the way the universities were constructed and structured, where everyone was in their separate discipline, even though we were all beginning to do work in the 60s, early 70s, that was already right outside of its disciplines, we were still in our separate boxes. And the space provided my friendship and contact with Billy Tanner, who I was really quite frightened by, who was very fierce. He was older than me and very articulate, but just those kind of conversations that led to collaborations that I would never have got into had I stuck in the art department in the university. So the space was an amazing space. I must say that there were similar collaborations in the garden parties that Bill Ainsley constructed in Johannesburg, where there were political, literary. I think the political questions united people across disciplines in a way that didn't happen perhaps in other countries as strongly. But the space in Cape Town was really the place that happened. And also one learned things. I remember not only being fascinated by the plays like Sizwe Banzi, but then Athol and Yvonne and people were around, and one got a sense of the real lives that motivated people to be in such performances, to be in the people are living the play was somehow also their real lives. And so I think it was just that opportunity to be part of, I used the word earlier, kind of collective endeavor that wasn't just political. It was a kind of, we're not going to give up. And everybody that you met from any other discipline or disciplinary background seemed to have that same passion. It was a place of passion and the determination to not turn away. I had a sense of this infinitely patient, very thoughtful, very careful, but not limiting, and trying to create a space for everybody to be in. I didn't have so much, I felt very young, and these were all the grown-ups. And not really knowing exactly. I wasn't there when people like Dimitri came back for the second space. That felt, I probably would have felt like a grown-up then. But Brian was, for me, this person. Brian was the space in a way. He held the space, if one puts it in that language, and he was kind. And I knew he was Yvonne's partner, and I thought he was very generous. And generous also to that situation, this intense, difficult situation. All the actors, everyone seemed to be in difficulty in their relationships and everything. But Brian held the space and made it possible for all of us to experiment. And he seemed to love experimentation. And there were probably things going on, or maybe people moaned, I don't know, but I don't remember the detail. My own memory of Brian was of this person who knew everything that was going on, kind of, didn't interfere, enabled lots of things, very good guy. I think one of the huge effects that the island and Sizwe Banzi had was, I remember also being a bit critical of them and being part of a group that was a bit critical of how Athol had worked with the black actors. But I nevertheless, I was so glad. I was so, not just respectful, I remember feeling so fortunate that the space existed, that Athol had worked with these actors, had not only given them a voice, but that I was able to. I remember the one main guy, John Carney, it probably was, just feeling, he was a kind of teacher in that play, and that I'd had access to those thoughts, those views, those passions, those emotions, even though, there were criticisms and questions around whose voice it was and Athol's role in writing for black people. But it felt like they had, I think what impressed me was I felt that they must have really co-scripted that stuff with him, and it wasn't just a white man's voice bringing black people into white people's world. So it felt there was an integrity that and a power, even though it was also irritating to watch lots of white people listening to black people, and somehow always the question, were they just going home and feeling better because they'd had some kind of catharsis. But they were radical. I remember just the movements in the one, I don't know if it was the island or Sizwe Banzi, but it felt like this, in theatre terms, I suppose, the taking away of the arch and the us and them. And this, I think one of them was sweeping, if I remember, in the play, and this movement into the audience and away. And I think those kind of very consciously choreographed, and elements of the theatre were actually, for me, very important. They were parallels in my own work, and they were about how through the form itself a lot of substance, a lot of contents came. And just remember that pushing into the audience, that sweeping, and there was no division, there was no arch, there was no pleasant stage and us and them. Billy took me into the art quite a lot, and I don't know how much the art, but certainly the theatre had a major influence on my work.
Brilliant, that's lovely.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Fabulous.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you so
It's a
much.
pleasure.